reading the Gemara. I'm going to pull it up on the screen from the sheets. Okay, so what we have here is Afilu ani shebi-Yisrael lo yochal ad sheyasev. As I mentioned, that's just a quote from the Mishnah. Now the Gemara starts off with Itmar. Now, generally, as I mentioned, Itmar is an introduction to a machloket, a debate between two amoraim, two people living in the time of the Gemara. Here it's a little bit different because usually it starts out immediately with a debate. This one doesn't. This one starts off like this. Matzah tzarich heseba. Maror ein tzarich heseba. This is something you're probably familiar with, which is when we eat the matzah, we're supposed to recline. When we eat the maror, we're not. So if we look in Rashi, Rashi gives us a good explanation here. Rashi says, matzah tzricha heseba, and this is probably something you could have figured out on your own. The idea of reclining, we know, is a sign of feeling like we're a free person. And why is that? To remind us of the redemption. So when we eat matzah, we're reminded of the redemption, and therefore we recline. Maror ein tzarich heseba, because we all know maror is bitter herbs. That's because we're supposed to be reminded of the fact that we were slaves. So that's already going to explain our very first line, which is pretty simple. Now it gets a little bit more complicated. Wine. What would you think if I asked you about wine? So generally, we understand that there's 4 cups of wine at the Seder. There could be various reasons given for why there's 4 cups at the Seder. The one that we typically know is that there's 4 lishonot of Geula, 4 words of redemption that are used when the Jewish people got out of Egypt. And therefore, it seems that wine would be an indicator of redemption. So it would seem that wine would be one of those mitzvot that you would need to recline for as a sign of showing our freedom. However, the 4 cups of wine, that's kind of something that people say, and it comes up in the Yerushalmi that that's the reason for the 4 cups, but it's not the only reason for the 4 cups. The 4 cups seem to frame the Seder. Okay, they say, how do they frame the Seder? Well, the first one is really like Kiddush. We talked about this the other day in last week's class, that there's parts of the Seder that are really typical for every meal. And in fact, if you had asked me to write this Gemara, I probably would have written it a little bit differently, because the first cup is typical for any meal. And the 3rd cup is typical for any meal, because the 3rd cup is connected with benching. And even though we don't typically do this at benching, you do see it when you have Sheva Brachot, and sometimes you'll be at a table where they will bench over a cup of wine. And those are 2 things that are kind of typical for a regular weekday or Shabbat, I would say, not weekday, but holiday festive meal, whereas you have Kiddush and then you have the 3rd one. So if you would have asked me, I would have said differently than the 2 versions of Rav Nachman. I would have said 1st and 3rd, maybe you don't need to lean. I don't want to confuse you, but that's what I would have thought, because those 2 are typical for any night, whereas 2nd and 4th are atypical. The 2nd cup we say on Magid. Magid is the whole section where we tell the story of getting out of Egypt. That's clearly unique for that night. And the 4th is said on Hallel. Now, we don't almost never say Hallel at night. It's very unique that we say it at night here, and we say it after the meal. So you would think that those 2 are more reflective of the redemption, but that's not in fact what the Gemara says. And what the Gemara suggests, and let's just go back to the sources now. Sorry. Okay, so what do we have in the Gemara? Let's go through the structure first, and then we'll see our different opinions. Yayin. Itmar. Now, this is a good example where you might have started to read this and say, Yayin Itmar, how does this work? So again, we started with matzah. This is a good clue. Today, I didn't give you a section to try to punctuate on your own first, but if you would try to punctuate this, here would be your clues. Matzah, maror, yayin, right? We have 3 topics, matzah, the bitter herbs, and then the wine. So you would know each one is kind of starting a new section. So now we have like the intro word is wine. That's our topic. And now we're going to have Itmar Mishmei de Rav Nachman, Tzarich Heseba, Ve'itmar Mishmei de Rav Nachman, Ein Tzarich Heseba. So something seems strange here. In fact, someone asked in the chat, doesn't make any sense. What do you mean? It was said in Rav Nachman's name that one needs to recline, but it was also said in Rav Nachman's name that one doesn't need to recline. So we have a bit of a problem here. How do we resolve it? So if you go to continue on in the Gemara resolves it by saying lo pligi, right? One explanation, by the way, could be very simply, there's 2 different versions of what Rav Nachman said. In one version, some of his students heard him say yes, and some of his students heard him say no. And that happens often in the Gemara. But if you can come up with a solution where you can make it that you don't have to change that, the Gemara would much prefer that option. So here comes the Gemara's answer. V'lo pligi, there's actually no debate. Ha betarte kase kamai. Okay, anyone who knows the books of the Tanakh, so there's something called Trei Asal, right? Those are 12 books of the prophets. Trei is 2. Okay, these are just good tactics to try to remind yourself how to remember words. Okay, I'll try to give you tips. Pligi is also a good word. Pligi is like plag mincha we learned in the beginning, which is half of, we didn't actually learn plag mincha. We learned about mincha ktana, mincha gdola. Plag mincha is half of mincha, right? Plag means half or split. So plag, plugta is all of those words usually mean machloket, debate. So lo pligi, there's really no debate between these two versions of Rav Nachman. Ha betarse kase kamai, ha betarte kase batrai. One of them, and this is why the Gemara becomes very confusing, because the Gemara tells us one is referring to the first 2 cups and one is referring to the second 2 cups. But if you notice, they don't tell you which is which. So we could start making arguments. I made a good argument for first and third and second and fourth, but that's not what the Gemara suggests. The Gemara splits between the first 2 and the second 2. So again, let's just talk about the first 2 and the second 2. The first 2 is the beginning of the meal when you make Kiddush. And the second 2, right, and then you tell the story. The second 2 are the meal and the benching, and then the Hallel that we say after where we praise. So now the Gemara continues on and says, Amre la lahai gisa, va'amre le lahai gisa. And now it becomes even more confusing because there's 2 different versions of how to understand this. So on the one hand, we're going to say there's really no argument here. On the other hand, there's clearly going to be an argument about how we resolve this. So Amre le lahai gisa. Now here, this is again, if you want to learn how to punctuate. So you see the same words repeated many times. Right? Amre le lahai gisa, va'amre le lahai gisa, amre le lahai gisa. And then, right, and then it's going to say again, va'amre le lahai gisa further on. So this is very classic in the Gemara where they'll give you a title sentence, which is, some people say it this way and some people say it that way, which are the words amre le lahai gisa and amre le lahai gisa. And then if they kind of stop, that's the title sentence. And then, right, like you did when you're in English class, when you're in elementary school, and they say, okay, you always have to have that title sentence. And now you go in depth and they say, okay, so Amri le lahai gisa, and this is the way they explain the first way. And Amri le lahai gisa, this is how they explain the second way. So Amri le lahai gisa, Trei kase kamai, Trei and tarter are one and the same, right? They both mean 2. The 2 first ones, bao heseba. Why would the 2 first ones need reclining? Dahash dehuda kamatcha lacherut. That's when you need to recline because that's when you're telling the story. And this is a fascinating line. You really have to think about what this means. And I can't promise I will tell you 100% because you don't really know what they mean. But it's very interesting. They say, Trei kase batrai lo ba'yo seba, mai dahava hava. What happened already happened. Meaning you're done with the Seder at that point. The main Seder is Magid. It's telling the story and experiencing the story. And you've experienced that story through the first 2 cups. You're already done at that point. The second part, okay, that's just extra, right? So that's the meal and that's the Hallel, but you're already done with the whole issue of feeling like free men. We finished that already. That's in the first part of the Haggadah. Now we're going to prove the opposite because that's what the Gemara loves to do. Take something, prove it, and then prove the exact opposite. Va'amar le lahai gisa, adraba, the exact reverse is true. Trei kase batrai bao heseba. It's the 2 later cups that need it. Why? Hahi shata de kahavya cherut. That's when you actually feel free. Trei kase kamai, but the first 2 lo bai heseba da'akate avadim hayinu ka'amre. You're still saying avadim hayinu at that point. Now here's something really interesting. What are they saying? They're saying that you have experienced something through that night. We start off, and this is, we talked about the lechem oni, how the matzah could be both something poor man's bread and also something that's reflecting the redemption. What you have here are 2 things going on at this night. You start off and you act like you're slaves. In fact, we have this custom some people do where they carry around the matzah over their shoulders when they break the middle matzah. And we feel like we actually went through some transition. And the second opinion is saying, you've gone through a transition tonight. You started off as slaves and you're now free people. And that's the idea here. Therefore, in the beginning of the meal, you don't recline because you haven't gotten there yet. You have to earn your freedom, right? We don't just get our freedom handed to us on a silver platter. You're not free when the night starts. You're only free later on in the evening. So it's a very interesting approach here between the 2 different approaches about how to understand what happens at the Seder. According to the first interpretation, everything happens in the Seder at the beginning. That's the main thing. The extra is, some desserts, some extra, but it's not the main part of the Seder. You're already done telling the story. And when you're talking about the experiential part, that happened already at the beginning. You're done with that already. It's so interesting. And that's why I said you have to think about my dahava hava, what was, and it's finished. But the other opinion is saying, no, there's really much more going on here. Okay. And that in the beginning, you start off as slaves and you end the night as free people. And that's why the first two you don't, the last two you do. Now here comes the interesting part of the Gemara. So we have this debate and we don't know how to resolve it. So what does the Gemara say? Okay, so moving on to the next source. The Gemara now says, Hashta de itmar hachi, ve'itmar hachi, since we have one approach to say the first 2 cups you should recline for. The other approach is to say the last 2 cups you should recline for. Now, one could say, so we don't know what to do. Maybe you don't recline at all. And in fact, the whole idea of reclining is only rabbinic in nature. It's not by Torah law. So you might have felt, let's be lenient, that they say, idi ve'idi ba'u heseba. So in the end, we're going to do everything. Okay. And that's what they conclude in the end. And what's really interesting about the Rishonim here is that the Ravya, who's from Germany in the 12th century, says something really fascinating. I don't know if you got to it yet, but if you didn't, we're going to read it together. V'yoshev beheseba, you sit while reclining. Ubizman hazeh, in our times, which is 12th century Germany, she'ein rehilut ba'artzenu la'asev, as I mentioned before, it's not something people do now, and it's not something people did then. She'ein rehilim b'nei cholim la'asev, it's not, people don't do this. So you might say, okay, so we do it for symbolic reasons, right? But what does he say? Yeshev kidarko. No need to recline. You don't need to do it at all. Fascinating, right? Did you know such a thing existed, right? We all bring pillows and we recline at the Seder. It's a big deal. He says there's no point. It's useless. Because what does he say? Okay, now we're going to see the difference in perspective. According to the Ravya, the idea of reclining is not symbolic, okay? We always think of it as symbolic. And Rashi goes with the symbolic approach, right? We're remembering the Geulah. And we're remembering, right, the bitter herbs, or to remember how hard it was. And we talked about, even the Gemara sounds like it. We're experiencing something, but experiencing it through remembering. But according to the Ravya, no, we're experiencing it actually in reality. And therefore, we do it as a sign that we're free people. Kind of like the way it actually sounds like the way the pshat of the Gemara is, which is, this is, you went through a process. So now you're reclining like free people. And therefore, according to the Ravya, this is not symbolic at all. And therefore, there's no point for it anymore. You're supposed to do it because you're supposed to recline, because that's a sign of freedom. But if it's no longer a sign of freedom, since free people nowadays don't recline, maybe it should be replaced with something else, something that is actually a sign of free people. Or according to the Ravya, he doesn't even think you need to replace it. He basically says it's an obsolete law, which is fascinating. Okay, we're going to keep him in mind because we're going to get back to an interesting opinion later on in the second section, okay, which is going to relate to this. Okay, so we basically have different approaches here. Oh, actually, it's here. Sorry, I thought it was in the second section. So I want to just end now with the Aruha Shulchan. So the Aruha Shulchan, basically, okay, this is from, he's from Russia in the 19th century, same time as the Chafetz Chaim, who wrote the Mishnah Berurah. He wrote another book that's similar to the Mishnah Berurah, but much more in-depth and detail-oriented. He says, Adraba, nir elani udati, dekevan de mitzvah la'asot shinuyim b'layla hazeh. He says, we shouldn't not recline nowadays. He says it should be the opposite. We try to do changes in our Seder. That's the whole manishtana. Why is this night different? Shetzarich la'asot shinuyim b'layla hazeh kedei shiru abanim v'yishalu. He says, and I'm not going to read the whole thing inside, you could read it in English and Hebrew, whatever is good for you. But what he says is, we want the children to ask. And we're going to have a whole shiur on the children should ask. And he says, based on what the Ravya says, he says the opposite. He says, you obviously need to recline because now and this is fascinating, because it originally maybe was a sign, that it was an actual indicator of freedom. It's a great example of how halacha changes over time, and the meaning of the exact same action means something different than it did then. Then you were actually reclining, doing something that was really a sign of free men. Now we're doing it symbolically to remember what it was for them. And he doesn't hold like the Ravya that because we don't do it nowadays, so there's no point. He says, no, all the more reason It's so that the children will ask, and that's why it becomes part of the 4 questions, because one of those questions that makes us say something about this night is different than all other nights. Okay, so what we've done so far is we've taken the issue of why we recline. We recline either, we have 2 approaches, either the symbolic approach. We want to do symbolic actions, just like matzah is symbolic to remind us of they got out of Egypt, and maror is symbolic to remind us how bitter their lives were. Reclining is all part of that, and it's a symbolic action, and therefore it doesn't almost matter whether we do it nowadays or we don't do it nowadays. It's just a symbolic action. Other than the Rav Yahu holds, this is something that we actually are supposed to feel like free men. And in fact, I'll end with this line in the Rambam, where the Rambam actually says, Shara chilato shtiato, while you're eating and drinking that whole night, he says, Im hesev hareze meshubach. If you can recline, you should, the whole meal. Because that's what, it's almost like in the line of the Rav Yah. That's what free people do. They eat while reclining. It's not just while we're doing the mitzvot. It's not just a symbolic act, but you're supposed to the whole night feel like you're a free person. So again, we didn't have time to go into everything and more about the differences between the first 2 and the second 2 and the different approaches, but we've understood the Gemara. We've understood why people recline, that there's 2 ways of looking at it. And now we're going to delve into the second part. The first part of the second section is going to be about how to recline. Which way do we recline? What might cause choking? We're going to see that somehow plays a role here in reclining. I want you to read, I brought in the Rashbam. I don't want you to get too caught up on the physiology of it and how he explains that, why it might cause one to choke. Okay, let's just kind of take it as a given, because otherwise we'll get stuck in that and we'll never move farther on. And the next question is going to be, we're going to get into some fascinating sections about women. Do women recline in the presence of their husband? Do sons recline in the presence of their fathers? Do students recline in the presence of their rabbis? So we're going to split now for chavruta. We're going to do a 15-minute chavruta now, or I think we could put 17 minutes. Okay, we'll do a 17-minute chavruta, and then we will come back together. Okay, so back to chavruta. You'll be in the same group as before. Again, if you don't want to be there, then you can opt in to stay in the main room and just don't click yes, I want to go into the breakout room. Just leave it and you won't end up in a breakout room and you'll stay in the main room.